Amara was a gentle schoolteacher in Abuja, who once dreamed of opening her own academy, but those dreams slowly faded when her husband Chike fell ill. Chike came from a wealthy family, and though they lived in a beautiful mansion filled with servants, it was Amara who chose to personally care for him every single day. She gave up her own ambitions, her teaching promotions, and even the joy of spending time with friends just to stay by his side. She cooked his meals herself, fed him when his hands were too weak, bathed him when he could no longer move easily, and always tried to make him smile even in his darkest moments. Her life became a circle of endless care, but she never complained, believing that love meant sacrifice. As the months dragged into years, whispers began to circle around her. Chike's siblings often mocked her behind closed doors, calling her nothing more than a servant in her own home. They accused her of being desperate to hold on to the marriage because of the family's fortune. Amara heard their sharp words, but she swallowed her pain and focused on her husband, telling herself that loyalty and faithfulness would one day be seen and rewarded. Night after night, when the house fell quiet, she knelt in prayer, begging God to heal Chike. Her heart ached, but her hope never wavered. Then came the day that shattered everything. Chike's condition worsened, and not long after, he passed away. The grief was already too much, but what followed cut her deeper than death itself. At the lawyer's reading of his will, Amara sat with trembling hands, certain that her sacrifices would finally be honored. Instead, the lawyer revealed that every single property, every company, every asset had been left to Chike's cousin Obinna. Amara's world collapsed in silence as relatives avoided her eyes. Later, whispers turned into cruel truths. Obinna had poisoned Chike's mind, convincing him that Amara's love was nothing but greed for wealth. Within days, she was forced out of the mansion she had once cared for, standing at the gates with only her suitcase. Neighbors watched with pity as she walked away, her tears hidden behind a veil of strength. She refused to collapse, even though everything seemed stolen from her. What she didn't yet know was that destiny had written a different ending. Weeks later, while sorting through old papers, she discovered documents Chike had signed years ago, papers giving her majority shares in his most valuable company. Holding those documents, she realized her sacrifices had not been in vain. With quiet determination, she stepped back into the world, not as the broken widow everyone expected, but as the rightful power in Chike's empire. At the company's annual dinner, she entered gracefully, and the board introduced her as the new chairwoman. The same relatives who once mocked her now clapped, their shame clear in their eyes. As Amara finally stood radiant and victorious, she sold her jewelry one piece at a time, starting with the gold earrings her mother had given her on her wedding day. Then went the bracelets, the necklaces, and even the ring she had cherished since childhood. Each item she let go of was another step into sacrifice, another silent promise that her husband's comfort came before her own happiness. Promotions came and slipped away like shadows because she could never stay late at school or travel for training. While others advanced in their careers, she quietly stayed behind, refusing opportunities that once meant everything to her. Her entire life began to revolve around Chike, his every breath, his every need. She became his shadow, moving wherever he moved, watching every detail so he would never feel abandoned. If he struggled to lift a spoon, she gently placed food in his hands. When his strength failed, she fed him herself, making sure he never went hungry. She warmed water for his bath, patiently washing him when his body felt too weak. She spoke to him with tender words when despair tried to steal his hope, reminding him that tomorrow might bring better days. On the darkest mornings, when the weight of sickness kept him on the bed, she sat beside him, telling jokes, singing softly, and urging him to smile even when tears sat heavy in her own eyes. The mansion was filled with people, but none gave the care she gave. Servants kept their distance. Relatives came only when convenient, but Amara carried the burden as though it was her sacred duty. She ignored her own exhaustion, the pounding headaches, the aching back from sleepless nights, because her love was stronger than pain. She would rise before dawn to prepare meals that might tempt his appetite, then stay awake long after midnight watching his breathing, terrified he might slip away in the silence. Every day became a battle, not just against the illness eating away at Chike, but against the loneliness that surrounded her. Neighbors whispered, family members mocked, yet she carried on as though none of it mattered. She lived for his smile, for the small moments when he laughed despite the sickness. To the world, it seemed as though she had lost herself, but to her, this was love in its purest form, giving everything, expecting nothing, and standing firm even when the nights felt endless. Amara's devotion turned her into more than a wife. She became the light keeping hope alive in a house drowning in shadows. That Chaik's siblings gathered often in the sitting room, their voices low but sharp enough for Amara to hear. They laughed and whispered that she was nothing more than a maid in her own house, a woman who had reduced herself to a servant just to hold on to a sick husband. Sometimes they said it loudly, making sure the sting reached her heart. They mocked her sacrifice, calling her desperate, saying she had no dignity left. Amara felt every word cut into her, but she chose silence. Instead of answering back, she turned her attention to Chaik, feeding him carefully, adjusting his pillows, making sure he was comfortable. To her, love meant action, not argument. Each insult became heavier than the last, but she carried them quietly like hidden stones in her chest. Relatives accused her of clinging to wealth that was never hers, pointing out that she had sold her jewelry and still gained nothing. They compared her to a common helper, sneering that no educated woman should lower herself so far. Amara swallowed her pain, knowing they could never understand the bond she shared with her husband. She told herself their voices did not matter, that one day truth would shine brighter than their cruelty. When visitors came, the siblings made sure to humiliate her with fake pity. They would smile sweetly at Chaik, then turn to Amara and remark on how tired she looked, as if she was a burden instead of a wife. They told neighbors that she had trapped herself in a cage of her own making, that she had wasted her youth on a man who might never recover. Amara kept her head down, hiding the tears that sometimes escaped when she was alone at night. She chose to see her sleepless nights, her endless patience, and her quiet prayers as a crown of loyalty, not chains of shame. Through it all, she never let bitterness take root. She continued to hold Chaik's hand, warming his cold fingers, speaking words of encouragement even when her own spirit shook. For every insult, she answered with another act of kindness toward her husband. While they whispered venom, she whispered prayers. While they laughed at her, she smiled gently at Chaik, refusing to let his heart feel unwanted. She ignored the taunts because her love was stronger than their mockery. And though they called her a maid, Amara knew deep inside that she was a wife whose devotion no insult could erase. The nights of prayer stretched endlessly for Amara as she sat beside her husband's bed, eyes heavy with exhaustion but heart burning with hope. When the house grew silent and the world outside rested, she stayed awake, whispering words to God with trembling lips. Her knees ached from kneeling for so long, but she refused to give up, believing every tear she shed was a seed of faith. She prayed for strength, for healing, for a miracle that would bring Chaik back to full life. Even when the doctors shook their heads, she lifted her hands to the heavens, convinced that loyalty and sacrifice would not go unnoticed. Candlelight flickered in the dark room as she poured out her soul, asking for mercy on the man she had given everything to. Sometimes she cried so hard that her chest tightened, but she kept praying through the sobs, wiping her tears with the edge of her wrapper. Her whispered words filled the night, blending with the sound of Chaik's troubled breathing. She prayed over his food before feeding him. She prayed over the water before bathing him. She prayed over the pillow before helping him sleep. Every small act became a silent offering, wrapped in faith. There were nights when her body begged her to rest, but her spirit refused. She walked the floors barefoot, pacing back and forth while holding her Bible to her chest. She recited verses aloud, believing they carried power strong enough to chase sickness away. When fear tried to creep in, she sang hymns softly, filling the cold air with warmth. Though her voice cracked, she sang louder, hoping heaven was listening. In those hours, it was not just about her husband's survival. It was about proving that her devotion was real, that her heart would never fail him. Neighbors sometimes heard her crying through the windows, but Amara did not care who saw her weakness. She knew her strength was in her prayers, and if she had to give up sleep night after night, she would. She dreamed that one day, she would see him rise from the bed, smiling again, telling her that her love had saved him. In her mind, every sleepless night was an investment in their future, a promise that sacrifice never goes unrewarded. Though her body grew weaker, her faith grew stronger, and in the quiet of those endless nights, Amara believed with all her heart that heaven was writing a better ending for her story. Every property and business is left to his cousin Obinna, not Amara. The lawyer's voice echoed through the room, each word striking like a sharp blade. Amara sat frozen, her hands trembling on her lap, her heart sinking as though the ground had disappeared beneath her. She had walked into that office expecting recognition for her years of sacrifice, hoping to see her name honored in the will of the man she had cared for with her entire soul. Instead, she sat in silence while relatives exchanged shocked glances, some hiding smirks, others whispering under their breath. The mansion, the cars, the companies, the accounts. Everything was handed over to Obinna. Amara could hardly breathe. Memories of long nights spent praying, of days spent feeding and bathing her husband, flashed through her mind like cruel reminders of what she had given up. She thought of the jewelry she sold, the promotions she turned down, the dreams she buried for the sake of love. And now, in a single moment, all of it seemed erased, replaced by the cold truth that she had been left with nothing. Obinna's eyes gleamed with pride as the lawyer continued reading, his smug expression confirming that this was no accident. Amara's chest tightened as realization dawned. Her husband's trust had been twisted, his mind poisoned against her. She could almost hear Obinna's sly words convincing Chaik that her devotion was greed, that her sleepless nights were an act, that she wanted his wealth and not his heart. Crushed her. Yet she held back tears, refusing to let them see her break. When the meeting ended, relatives walked past her without sympathy. Some whispered that she had wasted her life, others pitied her but did not dare to speak up. Obinna walked out proudly, already speaking as though he was the new head of the family. Amara stood quietly, her body heavy with grief, her spirit shaken but not destroyed. She left the office with no mansion to return to, no security to hold on to, only memories of love and sacrifice that now seemed betrayed. The world outside felt louder, harsher, as she stepped into it empty-handed. Yet deep inside, a small spark remained unbroken. Though the will had stripped her of everything, she carried something no paper could erase, her quiet strength, her silent dignity, and the knowledge that the story was not yet over. The betrayal exposed. It's revealed that Obinna had manipulated Chaik, convincing him that Amara only cared for his wealth. The truth came like a storm, tearing through every memory she had held close. Friends whispered it, neighbors confirmed it, and soon even relatives admitted that Obinna had been the shadow behind her suffering. While she spent years sacrificing her dreams, pouring her heart into caring for her husband, Obinna had been whispering poison into Chaik's ears. He painted her loyalty as greed, her sacrifices as schemes, and her endless devotion as a trap for riches that were never hers to begin with. Amara could almost hear the lies now. Obinna telling Chaik that no woman would sell her jewelry unless she was desperate for control, that no wife would miss work promotions unless she had her eyes fixed on the family fortune. He twisted every act of love into a reason for suspicion. He turned sleepless nights of prayer into signs of desperation. He poisoned Chaik's heart, until even the man she loved began to doubt her. It broke her to imagine her husband lying in bed, questioning the very woman who washed him, fed him, and held his hand when no one else cared. The anger from the relatives made the betrayal worse. Instead of defending her, many chose to believe Obinna's stories. They mocked her openly, repeating his lies, calling her a maid and an opportunist. They watched her sacrifice and called it a performance. For years, she endured it all, thinking time and faith would reveal the truth. But the revelation came too late. Only after Chaik's death. Only after she had been stripped of everything. Amara's chest tightened with pain each time she remembered how Obinna smirked at the will reading, how he walked out of the lawyer's office as though victory was his. He had won by twisting love into suspicion, by turning a faithful wife into a villain in her own home. Yet even with her heart shattered, she stood firm. She refused to let his betrayal define her. The exposure of his lies became a bitter wound, but it also lit a fire inside her. Amara understood now that she was not weak, and she was not alone. The same sacrifice Obinna mocked would one day be her strength. Though he had manipulated her husband against her, though he had stolen what was rightfully hers, she knew the story was not finished. Something greater waited for her beyond this betrayal. The widow's tears. Amara is thrown out of the mansion she once managed. The gates that once opened at her touch now shut against her. And the walls she had cared for felt like strangers. She stood outside with a small suitcase, the very house where she had cooked, cleaned, and prayed for her husband now belonging to someone else. Servants who once bowed to her avoided her eyes, unwilling to offer even a kind word. Relatives who once came to her table now pretended not to know her. The home she had filled with love turned into a place of rejection, pushing her out as though she had never belonged. Neighbors watched from across the street, whispering and shaking their heads. Some pitied her, saying it was unfair after all she had done, while others muttered that this was her fate for giving too much. Children pointed at her, asking questions their parents could not answer. Amara walked slowly down the road, tears sliding down her cheeks, but her back remained straight. Each step away from the mansion felt like leaving behind years of memories. Nights of prayer, mornings of care, laughter that had once filled the rooms. Everything had been taken from her, yet she refused to collapse in the dust. She spent nights in a small rented room, staring at the ceiling, her heart heavy but her spirit refusing to give in. She remembered the insults from Chaik's siblings, the smug look on Obina's face, and the betrayal she carried like a wound. Pain pressed on her, but she knew if she allowed it to crush her, she would never rise again. She wiped her tears with the edge of her wrapper, and told herself she was more than a widow thrown aside. She was still the woman who had sacrificed, who had endured, who had loved beyond measure. The days that followed were hard. She walked through markets with her head covered, avoiding curious stares. Some women offered her food, others comforted her with kind words, but deep inside she knew pity would not save her. She gathered strength from silence, promising herself she would not stay broken forever. Though she had been cast out with nothing, though the world saw her as defeated, Amara carried something they could not see, a quiet fire burning within, a determination to stand again. Her tears fell, but they did not drown her. They watered the seed of strength that was waiting to grow. The hidden papers. Weeks later, Amara finds old documents Chaik once signed, giving her shares in his most valuable company. It happened on a quiet evening when she was going through a small wooden box she had carried from the mansion. Inside were photographs, letters, and a few official envelopes she had never bothered to open. Her hands shook as she unfolded the yellowing sheets, and her eyes widened as she read the words. Chaik's signature was there, bold and clear, confirming she was the rightful owner of the largest share in his most profitable company. For a moment, she could not breathe. She read the lines again and again, making sure it was not a dream. The papers were not just scraps of ink. They were proof that her sacrifices had not been in vain. Her late husband had once trusted her enough to place the company in her hands, even if later he was deceived by Obina's lies. The discovery felt like a light breaking through the heavy darkness that had covered her life. Amara pressed the papers to her chest, tears flowing, not of sorrow this time, but of relief. She whispered a prayer of thanks, believing God had hidden these documents until the right time. The next day, she walked into the office of the company with the confidence she thought she had lost forever. Employees who had heard of her downfall looked at her with surprise as she held the signed documents high. Legal advisors confirmed the truth. She was not just a widow with nothing. She was the majority shareholder. Murmurs filled the building, spreading like fire that the woman everyone mocked now carried more power than any of them had imagined. Obina's face turned pale when he heard the news. The empire he thought belonged to him had slipped from his fingers. The lies he built began to crumble, leaving him exposed before the same family he had fooled. Relatives who once called her a maid now bowed their heads in shame, avoiding her eyes. Amara felt strength return to her bones. The tears she had cried in silence became her victory. The same woman who was thrown out of the mansion now stood taller than those who mocked her. Holding those hidden papers, she knew her story had changed. She was no longer broken, no longer powerless. She was ready to take back everything that was rightfully hers. The power shift. With quiet determination, Amara takes her rightful place as the true majority shareholder. She did not raise her voice or boast about her discovery. Instead, she walked into the boardroom with calm steps, carrying the documents that proved her ownership. The directors and investors looked at her with curiosity, some with doubt, until she laid the signed papers on the polished table. Silence filled the room as the lawyer confirmed every word written there. Amara was no longer the widow thrown out with nothing. She was the rightful controller of the company. Obina sat stiff in his chair, his smug smile fading as reality hit him. He tried to argue. He shouted that the company was his, but the evidence crushed his claims. The same people who once bowed to him now turned away, whispering about his lies. His disgrace unfolded before everyone. The proud cousin who had mocked her was stripped of the power he thought was untouchable. Amara did not gloat or laugh. She only watched with steady eyes as the tables turned. The board members began to nod in respect, some even apologizing for believing the wrong person. They praised her strength, saying she had shown more courage than anyone expected. Amara listened quietly, her heart steady. This was not about revenge. It was about truth. She remembered the long nights of prayer, the cruel whispers from family, the day she was thrown out of the mansion. All of it had led to this moment, where her dignity was restored. Obinna left the room with his head down, the disgrace following him like a shadow. He had lost not only wealth but also respect. The same relatives who once joined him in mocking her now avoided him, ashamed of their part in her suffering. Amara, on the other hand, stood taller than ever, her voice calm but firm as she addressed the board. She promised to protect the company, to honor her husband's legacy, and to prove that she was not just a grieving widow but a leader with vision. The shift in power was more than business. It was her rebirth. Amara knew her life would never be the same again. She had risen from betrayal, from humiliation, from tears, and now she stood where no one thought she would. The woman once dismissed as a maid in her own home was now the rightful queen of an empire. The viral ending. At the company's annual dinner, Amara walks in radiant, as the board introduces her as the new chairwoman. The hall was decorated with golden lights, music filled the air, and guests arrived in sparkling clothes. But all eyes turned when she stepped through the doors. She wore a graceful gown, her head held high, her smile calm yet powerful. Whispers spread quickly across the room. This was the same woman who had once been mocked, thrown out, and humiliated. Tonight, she was not a widow in pain but the leader of the empire everyone thought she had lost. The directors rose from their seats as the announcement was made. The lawyer confirmed her rightful place, and the entire board stood to applaud. Cameras flashed, capturing her every step as she walked to the stage. Investors who once doubted her now extended their hands with respect. The same relatives who had called her a maid, who had whispered cruel words behind her back, now clapped loudly, their faces red with shame. They smiled to hide their guilt, but the truth was written clearly in their eyes. They had underestimated her, and now they had no choice but to bow before her strength. Obinna sat in the corner, his pride shattered, unable to meet her gaze. He had walked into the room believing he would be celebrated, but instead he watched as the power slipped away forever. The tables had turned, and the woman he once mocked now stood higher than he could ever reach. Amara did not look at him with anger. She did not seek revenge. She simply smiled with dignity, proving that true victory is silent, graceful, and undeniable. The hall erupted in cheers as she spoke her first words as chairwoman. She promised growth, unity, and integrity, showing everyone that she was not just a symbol of survival, but a leader ready to build a future. Her voice was steady, her presence commanding, and the applause grew louder, echoing like thunder across the grand hall. What began as a story of sacrifice and betrayal ended as a story of triumph. Amara had risen from tears to power, from rejection to honor. The night became unforgettable, a moment that spread beyond the walls of the company, inspiring everyone who heard her story. Hi, besties Sparkles, thank you so much for watching to the end. Red Heart, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thumbs up. See you in the next story. Two Hearts. Bye.